It's September 20th, 1979. Lee Iacocca becomes president of the Chrysler Corporation, English footballer Sean Davis is born, and NBC premieres a brand new take on a very old story. Welcome to That 70s Review. Hello fellow time travelers, and welcome to That 70s Review, where we look at shows that we loved as kids and which you're coming to love as adults to see if they hold up. And this time we're looking at
Dodgers in the 24th and a half century.
No, we're not. As much as I would like to, no. Instead, we're looking at the show that was inspired by the exact same thing that was. In 1978, Buck Rogers was celebrating its 50th anniversary as a franchise. I know how he feels. His first appearance was in the pulp magazine Amazing Stories, in a novella called Armageddon 2419, written by Philip Francis Nolan in 1928. In this novella, Buck Rogers, a veteran of the Great War, that's World War I to you and me, goes into a deserted mine and gets put to sleep by a radioactive gas because that's a thing that happens. And he remains in suspended animation for the next 500 years. He wakes up to find a world dominated by the Chinese, rather than a world dominated by the so-called Chinese virus. And he soon meets and makes friends with some inhabitants of this brave new world, including Wilma Deering and Dr. Hewer. The novella turned out to be so popular that it quickly spawned a comic strip, then the very first sci-fi radio show, then a comic book, and then a series of movie serials starring Buster Crabbe. Man, that's really hard to say. And eventually spawned its own TV show in the 1950s. By all accounts, this was a very low-budget affair, and it turns out that only one episode of it still exists. I'll put a link in the description because, of course, it still lives on YouTube.
Buck Rogers in the 25th century.
Does that intro look at all familiar to you?
Dodgers.
I should probably also mention the short film that was made for the 1933 World's Fair here in Chicago, and unfortunately that still exists. The film, I mean, not Chicago, even though Chicago exists. Oh, come on, what do you want from me? And also by the 1950s, Buck Rogers had spawned a whole slew of imitators, including Flash Gordon and John Carter of Mars here in the States, and Dan Dare in the UK. But for the next 3 decades, Buck Rogers himself appeared only in the comic strips, and surprisingly, in only one Gold Key comic. Surprising because Gold Key made comics of everything. And I mean everything. In 1978, Glenn A. Larson and his writing partner Leslie Stevens were doing Battlestar Galactica when they decided to revive the Buck Rogers franchise with a new series. Larson already had a development deal with NBC, and he took the opportunity to use a lot of what he'd learned producing Battlestar Galactica to do this show, and to reuse a lot of what he'd had built for that series, but we'll come back to that. Larson cast Gil Gerard as William Buck Rogers, Tim O'Connor as Dr. Hewer, and the absolutely amazing Aaron Gray as Commander Wilma Deering. I'm sorry, but I absolutely adore Aaron Gray, and by the end of this review, you'll probably see why, and you might even agree. While still producing Battlestar Galactica, Larson and Stevens wrote and developed a TV movie, and based on the success that Universal had had in releasing the Battlestar Galactica pilot in theaters overseas, they released this as a movie in the States in March of 1979. And it actually did pretty well. It pulled in an impressive $21 million, which in 2021 dollars would be $85 million. That's not terribly bad for something made for television. On the strength of that, Buck Rogers was greenlit for a series that coming fall. By then, Battlestar Galactica was off the air, and there wasn't all that much on television to compete with it, so it had a ready-made audience of lots of excited kids looking to replace their favorite sci-fi show. The first season did well enough ratings-wise, but then the actors' strike of 1980 ended up delaying production of the second season until later that year. And at this point, I need to explain exactly how I'm doing this. The name of this channel is That 70s Review, so usually I only cover shows that began or ran in the 1970s. That means that future episodes are only going to cover the episodes of a show that actually aired in the 1970s. On those rare occasions where a season extends even briefly into the 1980s, I'll go ahead and cover the episodes that extend into the 1980s as well, but that's where it'll stop. Which is precisely why we're not doing Galactica 1980, because not only did it start in 1980, but I just don't have the strength or the patience right now. This also means I won't be covering the second season of Buck Rogers, which is just as well because essentially it is a completely different show. So, how well does this show hold up now? There's not much you can say against the premise. I mean, it worked for decades for this franchise before this show even started. The biggest difference is that in the new show, Buck Rogers is... well, tell you what, why don't I let William Conrad explain that to you?
The year is 1987, and NASA launches the last of America's deep space probes. In a freak mishap, Ranger 3 and its pilot, Captain William Buck Rogers, are blown out of their trajectory into an orbit which freezes his life support systems and returns Buck Rogers to Earth 500 years later.
One thing I will say is that is truly an amazing opening. I mean, there's such a promise of real excitement and adventure in there. However, it's also true that this opening is very different from the one that opened the pilot film that was in theaters, which promised something very different. For one thing, the movie theme has lyrics, but they're a bit underwhelming.
Far beyond the world I've known, far beyond my time. What am I? Who am I? What will I be? Where am I going? And what will I see?
Yeah, that's a very different vibe than the TV version. And speaking of different vibes, here's what the movie opening looks like.
Time. What am I? Who am I? What will I be? Where am I going? And what will I see? Searching my mind for some
Yeah,
truths to
that promises something very different, all right. Those women you see crawling all over the unconscious form of William Buck Rogers as he lies in state on the logo of his own movie are Pamela Hensley as Princess Ardala and Erin Gray, who for some reason they have acting entirely different from her character. Oh, who am I kidding? I know exactly why they have her acting like that. As you might guess from that softcore porn opening, the movie has just enough sexy stuff to score it a PG, and if you have the original DVD release, that's the version you're getting. Lucky you. So it should come as no surprise that later in the movie, you actually get to hear Buck Rogers say shit. It only happens once, but it could never have happened on the show. Once we're past the titillation in the 25th century bit, the story proceeds much as it does on TV. Buck's ship is rescued by Princess Ardala and Killer Kane, the big bads of the 1930s. Actually, Kane isn't Killer Kane here for some reason, and is here an Earthman working with the Draconians. After a bit of fun 70s drunk acting, Buck is finally sent onto Earth after the Draconians plant a beacon on the ship so that they can get through Earth's defense field later. He's intercepted by Wilma, who here is a colonel in the Earth Defense Directorate, which is a very welcome change for the character. When he finally lands in the futuristic city of New Chicago, he's questioned by Dr. Hewer, the head of the Earth Defense Directorate, and discovers that the rest of Earth is essentially a wasteland after nuclear holocaust destroyed everything not long after he left in 1987. And yes, that's news to me too. After meeting Wilma and Hewer, he then unfortunately meets the two latest entries in what I like to call those damn 70s robots. As I noted previously in my reviews of Wonder Woman and Battlestar Galactica, Star Wars had, shall we say, not exactly the best influence on 70s science fiction television. If a show was at all sci-fi inflected, it had to have a robot. Sometimes two, and this is an unfortunate case of the latter. First we get Twiki, played by Felix Sela in the suit, and voiced by no less than Mel Blanc. Trust me, that voice will get old very, very quickly. As you saw there, Twiki seems to know a lot more about Buck's lingo and what he's used to than Wilma or Hewer do, because they don't know about the culture of 500 years ago. And while that's hand-waved later in the season with a line about Buck teaching him about all these things, he seems to already know it, just for the lulz, or the lack thereof. The other robot, Dr. Theopolis, or Theo for short, is one of Earth's Robot Ruling Council, or is it Ruling Robot Council? I'm not really sure. Anyway, since he's essentially just an emoticon, he needs to be carried around by Twiki at all times. Unfortunately, in later episodes, Twiki's not really carrying Theo all that much and ends up becoming Buck's sidekick, so we get to enjoy him and his memorable personality all by themselves.
Rudy, get down.
Joy and rapture. Now, I really need to be honest. There were obviously other science fiction shows in the 1970s with robots well before this, and as a 9-year-old watching the show, I found these two characters delightful. I even had a Twiki figure that I loved to pieces. Quite literally, in fact. However, if you're not 9 years old, you might not like them all that much, especially when they get played for almost nothing but comic relief, which is almost all the time. Just listen to the music when they're introduced.
What is that?
This is Twiki. He's your drone.
My what?
Remember, Theo is supposed to be a leader on the Robot Council, and this is the music they associate with him. I mean, to be honest, it's probably more associated with Twiki, but still. This cuts entirely against the otherwise darker and grittier approach in the movie, and if that bothers you, you wouldn't be alone in that feeling, but again, we'll talk about that soon. Because he's curious to know what ended up happening to Chicago and to his family who lived there, Buck takes the droids, the robots, with him and sneaks out into the ruins that still surround New Chicago to this day. Well, for now, anyway. Which still have the mutated descendants of the survivors of the war. And they also seem to be members of Stomp for some reason. But he also discovers his parents' graves in a surprisingly moving sequence. The rest of the movie goes much as you'd expect. Buck is put on trial after being accused of working for the Draconians, and Buck tries to get these square future cats to dance to some funky disco beats that would have been even deader than Chicago currently is long before he ever left the Earth.
Groovy. Get down.
We then get the first of many space battles. The first of many times, oh so many times, when Buck drugs somebody. And Buck finally winning Wilma over by helping her fight off the Draconian pirates. This darker, grittier post-apocalyptic setting is actually a pretty good take on the premise, giving this version a much more serious feel initially that previous iterations really didn't have. So naturally, by the time we get to the series, that's one of the first things to go right out the window. So that's the movie, but how well does the show hold up? Well, the answer is not too well, to be entirely honest. Almost every good thing the show has going for it is countered to some degree by something that works directly against it. For example, it has relatively decent special effects for the time, mainly because so many of the ships were borrowed from Battlestar Galactica and retooled. Even the sound effects are from Battlestar Galactica. Seriously, just listen. See what I mean? One thing that Buck Rogers unfortunately doesn't borrow from Battlestar Galactica, despite that pretty catchy opening theme, is the style of music, which sounds like just about every other drama show produced on NBC in the 1970s. I know that may sound like a minor thing, but trust me, it makes a huge difference. And as I've already said, it has some really decent lead actors, though the show falls somewhat short of giving them any chance to give their characters any decent characterization. Tim O'Connor, for example, is amazing as Dr. Hewer, playing him with just the right combination of leadership and good humor, but he doesn't actually get backstory until the 19th and 20th episodes of this season, and then he's gone for season 2, which is just a waste of talent. And as I said earlier, Aaron Gray is just a marvel. There's absolutely no doubt why Wilma Deering is the commander of the Earth Defense Directorate Forces. I keep wanting to say erectile dysfunction forces for some reason. And because of that, we get none of the weird questioning that we get on shows like Battlestar Galactica about whether or not women are capable of being competent pilots or not. But since this is also the 1970s, and she's also ostensibly the love interest for Buck, the show has her questioning quite often whether she's feminine enough for him, even though it's quite clear that she is.
Buck, I know I've been aloof towards you and cold. I was frightened, afraid to get involved. Things are going to be different now between us. I'm not all business. I'm every bit the woman that the princess was.
That's nice.
And from this moment on, I'm going to prove it to you.
What?
That's how the movie ends, by the way, and it's only Aaron Gray's performance that sells how quickly she's come down with the fever for Buck Rogers. The character usually comes off much stronger than this, though, in later episodes, despite their really doing nothing with the romance this season. She even rescues Buck once or twice, which doesn't end up sitting well with the show's lead actor. Which brings us to Gil Gerard, who I must admit is my very first crush because of this show. Yeah, I got a little bit of an early start, obviously. As you might expect, Buck is the proverbial fish out of water, and has to deal with having lost everything, and Gil Gerard plays that very well. That graveyard scene, for example, is almost enough to make you forget you're watching post-apocalyptic Chicago on the backlot at Universal. Yeah, that looks nothing like Chicago. Except maybe in my neighborhood. But even in the movie, Buck is presented as the wisecracking type, something that Gerard reportedly hated to the point that he often refused to deliver some of his more comedically intended lines, and he kept pushing for more serious storytelling, something, frankly, Buck Rogers could have used as a series. But reportedly, this also made him difficult to work with. He objected quite often to Wilma rescuing Buck, and it got so bad that 2 of the show's writers actually quit halfway through season 1 after meeting with him about these demands. All of these troubles would come back to haunt the show even during season 2, despite its total change in direction. You have to give him credit, though. He's not entirely wrong. Although Twiki gets used seriously later on in season 1, he's essentially comic relief for most of the time, sometimes embarrassingly so, and so are the other leads. When you have the head of the Earth Defense Directorate as part of a so-called humorous subplot about taking care of Buck's rubber plant, you know that something has gone off the rails somewhere. And finally, even though this is something of a minor quibble, the pre-credits teasers for each episode do more to ruin each show's plot than just about anything I've ever seen in a show that has something like that.
I want Buck Rogers.
I think he'd make you a very bad spouse, Princess.
Princess Ardala returns with a diabolical scheme to bring the Earth to its knees and Buck Rogers to the altar.
You will be joined with Princess Ardala forever.
Talk about shotgun weddings.
I must be one in order to be wed.
Dr. Ewart, it's glowing.
Destroy it, now!
Our pulsars have no effect.
But hey, at least you get good warning about where each episode is headed before you have to sit through it. The first episode, a 2-parter called Planet of the Slave Girls, tells you exactly where this show is headed. Buck refuses to join the Defense Directorate, which he does at the end of the televised version of the pilot, not at the end of the movie. And yet by this 2-parter, he's not only graduated from space pilot school in record time, he's already flying with Wilma on missions, and he's already used to their form of interstellar travel, the Stargates. No, not those Stargates, these Stargates. Which isn't much better, really. I mean, don't they look like the covers to some rock album from the 1970s? We now discover that humans live on planets other than Earth, and all of that weird futuristic calm that the humans had in the movie that made them so different from anybody that Buck knew in his own time, completely gone. They may live in the future, but they act just like us now. They can't understand Buck's lingo, but that's what Twiki is for better or for worse. This one features an over-the-top Jack Palance, I know, what other kind is there, as a dictator on, you guessed it, the Planet of the Slave Girls, which is really odd given that Wilma and Hewer apparently have never heard of slavery. Really? And as if Palance needed any more reason to overact, they also give him these bizarre powers.
He says you are the one that makes us work for the governor. He says you sell us and keep the money. He's afraid of the future, afraid of dying for the cause, afraid not for everyone else, but for himself.
Do not harm him! You have nothing to fear. My touch is the touch of truth, the kiss of God. If your heart is good and true, you shall live. If not,
please, don't. Lena, help me. Lena, for God's sake, help me. No.
And there's even a reference to O.J. Simpson, which in retrospect is just a little bit off-putting. Literally, the only reason to watch this episode is the cameo of Buster Crabbe himself as a crusty old pilot who comes to help Buck out.
Hey, nice double teaming over there, whoever you are.
Gordon's the name, thanks.
We met Gordon?
I don't think so, Captain. We're from different times.
But apart from the nostalgia boner that may give you, this episode is really painful to watch, especially since it is a two-parter. The next one, despite the stupid title Vegas in Space, no, not the movie about drag queens, the writers seem to have remembered that Buck might need to be trained to pilot these ships, and that he's also still thinking about everything that he's lost since coming to the 25th century. We also get to see in this episode what might have been when he's paired with Major Marla Landers, played by Juanine Clay. Originally, Clay was meant to play Wilma because Erin Gray had decided not to come back and reprise her role from the movie, but she ended up changing her mind and they had to give Gray something to do. It's almost a pity because she and Gerard have really good chemistry, and she would have made a great addition. This also marks the second time that Buck roofies somebody in the line of duty, which is really starting to get just a little bit troubling. Oh, and just so you know, the Joker's in this one. Well, Cesar Romero is in this one. And that's only really interesting because of who's in the episode after this. The next episode is another two-parter, The Plot to Kill a City, by one of those two writers who eventually quit. Now, to their credit, if any of these early episodes feels like a callback to earlier Buck Rogers story, it's this one, which is actually entertaining in a number of ways. There's even a villainous character named Barney, named after an old franchise regular to give us yet another nostalgia boner, or whatever your equivalent is. And this one features Frank Gorshin, yes, the Riddler, who is the leader of the Legion of Death. I said Legion of Death, damn it, not Legion of Doom. Okay, that's better. Anyway, since none of the members of this Legion of Death have ever met each other, no one knows what one of the members looks like, and so Buck goes undercover as that person, which makes his first mission for the EDD feel more like he's working for the INF. This one also has a young Marky Post as the ex-girlfriend of the guy that Buck is posing as, who nearly blows his cover. And while Twiki is actually a little bit funny here, you could go your whole life without seeing him creep on Marky Post.
He is everything you said he'd be, Buck.
What's so funny?
He is, didn't you hear? Teacher Wiki, really now?
Ugh. I'd make a joke about hardware and software here, but really, this show is watched by kids.
The Starfighter and Buck Rogers.
Okay, Kane, get ready to fight.
Meet Kane and the Draconian Marauder.
You'll never catch me.
Planes need assembly. Each plane an action figure sold separately. There's Twiki.
Get the robot.
You can pretend he's being chased by Draco, Tiger Man, and the Draconian Guard.
Calling Buck Rogers, help!
Buck Rogers, Twiki, Draco, and Tiger Man. Each sold separately by Mego.
Otherwise, this is actually one of the more watchable episodes, showing us more of New Chicago and giving Buck more action. This is also the first of many times that Wilma goes undercover, which always gives Erin Gray a lot more fun things to do in each episode. The next episode, The Return of the Fighting 69th, isn't bad, but it's really odd in some parts. Speaking of that earlier reference to the IMF, this one features Peter Graves, along with KT Stevens, as members of a retired pilot squadron that Wilma turns to after some rookie pilots are killed on a mission to stop a gunrunner. Not only does this one give Wilma some much-needed backstory and character development, we find out in this episode that the age of retirement in the 25th century is now 85. I really hope that's because healthcare is better and not because they have a sucky Congress like we do. This one has a fairly sweet ending, but the plot with the retirees has aged better. See what I did there? Oh, God. It's aged better than the subplot with the deaf and mute slave girl, which is just really unfortunate. The next two episodes are named Unchained Woman and Planet of the Amazon Women. Do you see a pattern emerging somehow? In the first one, Halloween's Jamie Lee Curtis plays the ex of a criminal who is now testifying against her ex-boyfriend, and it features a malfunctioning Terminator-like android who goes after Buck and is much more realistic than the robots on Earth for some reason. And in the second one, Buck is lured into a honey trap to that aforementioned planet of Amazon women, where he is to be sold as a male slave because the planet's men have all been killed in some sort of war. Kind of like Lysistrata, though not nearly as good. The only noteworthy thing about this episode is that Wilma gets to rescue Buck this time. And now we come to one of my least two favorite episodes in Season 1, and they both share the same common denominator, Gary friggin' Coleman. Gary Coleman at that point was riding high, so to speak, on the success of Different Strokes, and never, ever, ever asked me to review that show. Please? As a result, NBC put him in as many projects as they could, and so an episode of this show was specifically written for him. In Cosmic Whiz Kid, oh my god, with these titles. In Cosmic Whiz Kid, he's Hieronymus Fox, a 493-year-old super genius who put himself into cryonic suspension just before the nuclear war. Good for us. He's been kidnapped and held for ransom by my favorite Martian, Ray Walston, who plays villains really quite well. There are some good special effects in this one.
What's that?
It's called a photon shield.
25th century minefield.
Yeah, except that the entire field is a mine. One step and we'd be paralyzed instantly. Unless I use this, that is.
Very nice.
But otherwise, my god, this one is dumb. The writers, and yes, these are the ones who quit, undercut Buck as a man out of time by upstaging him with a child genius who is also out of time. On the other hand, we're given a rather flamboyantly gay character in the form of Leslie Fletcher. And this character also turns out to be some form of super fighting machine?
Sweeney has a private flight hangar as well. We could use the heat sensors on board your ship to detect any unusual energy sources in the area and...
Yeah, I heard your tired pussy was on sale at the International House of...
Yeah, with your mama, bitch.
Oh, you missed...
Take it to the street, please! I need some butch faggots over here!
Come on,
Come on, I need some dick!
Get off of me! Shit!
And we discover that Wilma has a degree in electronics?
So, here's the central core of our operation, the nerve center, you would call it. From here, we dispatch food, supplies, fuel, and power to all the surrounding territories. I'm not going too fast for you, am I, dearing? I mean, I know you organic life forms need lots of time to assimilate information. I wouldn't want to strain your synapses.
I was just noticing your vid screens. I take it they're monitoring all incoming requests for supplies from private residences?
Oh, very good, dearing. They didn't give you that degree in electronics for nothing, did they?
I guess this comes in handy because this is yet another episode where she rescues Buck. Apart from some interesting insights into the tensions between the artificial life forms and the humans of the 25th century, which never gets explored any further in the season, this episode can be skipped, and no harm will come to you, ever. In the next episode, Escape from Wedded Bliss, we get the welcome return of Ardala, whom I haven't mentioned nearly enough so far. Pamela Hensley plays Princess Ardala as a campy character from a nighttime soap, and seriously, I love her to bits in this show. Problem is, she only gets 4 appearances for the entire season, and we're only just now getting her second appearance. Ardala attacks New Chicago with a powerful weapon and threatens to destroy every city on Earth, and by the way, there are now other cities on Earth besides New Chicago, if Buck doesn't become her mate. Damn, girl, I know he has an amazing chest, but really, there are much easier men you could get hold of on OnlyFans. This one features Kane again, this time played by the lovely Michael Ansara, and brings back Tiger Man, who is a character from the movie that I just didn't feel like talking about at all. Apparently he was popular enough that they killed him in the movie, then brought him back in the series, much as they did with Baltar and Battlestar Galactica, but I just can't see the appeal myself, and I usually go for that type. The weapon itself is pretty awesome looking, and Hewer gets some leadership scenes while Twiki actually gets used well for once. But we also get Buck drugging Ardala again. This is the second time for her and the third time for him, if you're keeping score. And we get a f***ing disco skate dancing scene at the reception for the Draconians that goes on for 3 minutes. 3 minutes that seem like 30, which I'm sure is Captain Rogers' fault because they didn't dance like this before he came along. In fact, for someone from 1987, his tastes are really retro. At one point, he's even listening to Three Dog Night. Wouldn't he have been more of a Bon Jovi fan or something like that? Oh, come on. I like Bon Jovi. Give it a rest. The next episode, Cruise Ship to the Stars, is also hard to watch, but for completely different reasons. Miss Cosmos is played by Dorothy Stratton, the August 1979 Playmate of the Month, who was murdered by her husband just 8 months after this episode aired. We don't even get to hear the poor thing's voice. She's dubbed by Anne Lockhart from Battlestar Galactica.
Thank you, Captain. I realized that being so far from my home planet creates its own anxieties. But since I've been aboard your cruiser, the Lyran Queen, I sense that someone has been watching me.
We get to see what Buck's social life is like, playing poker with Hewer and Wilma, and seeing them not liking his cooking, which is kind of a recurring joke. We also learn that Buck is now something of a celebrity for being the only person still alive from the 20th century. The only person still alive from the 20th century. Also, Wilma gets to go undercover in this getup, which gives Erin Gray a lot of fun stuff to do. And Twiki gets a female counterpart named Tina, which is actually a bit funny and leads directly to those hardware-software jokes I was trying to avoid earlier.
Booty, booty. Something from the bar, sir?
Hold the phone.
Nothing for me, thanks.
Booty, booty.
Biddy, 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 biddy.
Booty, booty, booty.
Biddy, 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 biddy.
Booty, booty, booty.
Biddy, 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 biddy.
There's also the interesting concept of an assassin with 2 faces and 2 different personalities, and we even get a preview of the Searcher, which is the ship that they'll end up using in Season 2. Then again, we get another damn dance scene that could only have been filmed in the 1970s. Weren't these the same future people that didn't know how to boogie just 12 episodes ago? Damn you, Captain Rogers. Then there's Space Vampire, one of the most interesting and also most disappointing episodes of the season all in one. Personally, I have very strong memories of this one as it freaked me out to no end when I was a kid. Now that I'm older and a big fan of Bram Stoker's Dracula, I very much appreciate what the writers were trying to do with this one, even if they didn't quite stick the landing. Buck and Wilma visit a starbase where a freighter has crashed into the side. Everyone aboard is in a weird state between life and death, and the captain's log entries about the horror that is slowly taking over her ship are good callbacks to the logs of the ship Verna in Stoker's book. The red light that shows the vampire's point of view, it's called a Vorvon here, by the way, is used carefully and is surprisingly effective. This is also one of the few times that Wilma herself is put in the damsel in distress role, though you hardly notice it given the strength of Erin Gray's performance. She absolutely throws herself into it, as usual, especially when the Vorvon takes control of her and she goes all Lucy Westenray on Buck. Yeah, that's another Stoker reference.
is an alien on board. A Vorvan.
I know.
Wilma, how'd you get past the guards?
I trained them. I stole their essence. It felt so good. It was so easy.
Wilma, no.
Yes. Plead with me. I like the taste of fear best of all. You tricked me.
Unfortunately, none of the high stakes promised at the beginning of this episode, or with Wilma being turned into a vampire herself, are followed through to the end. Not to mention that the Vorvan looks like this. Now, I hate to belittle something just for the effects. I'm a Doctor Who fan, for crying out loud, so I should really be used to them. But this show had a budget, and they came up with this unibrowed biological disaster. His eyes also make this odd video game sound.
What are you doing here? Who are you? Who are you? Get away!
There's a good sense of menace in this one, but in the end, there are far too many missed opportunities. In the episode Happy Birthday, Buck, we're reminded of what Buck has lost by having him experience homesickness on what is his 534th birthday. This one has a few interesting elements. It reveals that Dr. Hewer has made enemies over the years, and we discover that New Chicago is not the only new city on the planet, since Buck and his foil of the week, played by Morgan Brittany, travel to New Detroit. I wonder if there's a new New York.
Strictly speaking, it's the 15th New York since the original. So that makes it new.
But now that we're 16 episodes into a 24-episode season, in a blast for Buck, we get a clip show. A f***ing clip show. And on top of it all, it has Gary Coleman in it. This still isn't the worst clip show ever done for a sci-fi series, but it comes damn close. Ardala finally returns in the next episode titled, well, Ardala Returns, in which Buck is intrigued by what appears to be a space vessel from his own time. Instead, it turns out to be a trap laid by Ardala so she can make android duplicates of him called Zygots. No, those are Zygons, but they can duplicate people too. Kane's plan is to have a duplicate Buck lead a wave of fighters against Earth, but Ardala's plan is to send a duplicate Buck containing a bomb back to Earth. Try saying that a few times fast. You probably will be able to do it because I couldn't. And to have a few duplicates of her own to do whatever she wants to with.
What can she conceivably do with 3 Buck Rogers for an hour and a half?
Oh, buddy, if I have to tell you. But this one actually gives Twiki a decent purpose for once, having him help Buck out in a way that no human could ever do.
I believe I've located Twiki on board the Draconian ship, Doctor. Yes, those are his EM transmissions.
Fortunately, they're close enough to Earth to get a tight beam through.
Twiki,
Can
we use you as a relay to Buck?
Take me. I'm yours.
It also has some of the best scenes between Gil Gerard and Pamela Hensley in the entire season. Now, it is likely that all of her advances might make some people uncomfortable because they seem very much like sexual harassment these days. But there's a scene between the two of them midway through the episode that really brings out their characters quite well.
I may be a draconian princess, but I still have feelings. If I told you that I'd adjusted to the idea that our relationship was one-sided, that your feelings for me would never be as intense as my feelings for you. Would you simply be my consort?
Not your husband?
No.
Not your slave?
No, Buck, never.
I'm sorry. I can't.
But how can you reject me? I'm a draconian princess. Buck, look at me. Am I so horrible? Am I not beautiful enough for you?
You're one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen.
Then why can't you love me?
I can't change my feelings simply because you want me to.
But how do you know, Buck? You've never tried.
Love isn't something that two people can try to make happen. They either have something very special or they don't. And we don't, Ardala.
And by the end of this one, when Ardala realizes he's just not into her, and thus decides to attack Earth as a result, you can almost understand why. Almost. You might cheer when you hear the name of the next episode, Twiki is Missing, but then you would be me. And this one is a little odd. For one thing, we learned that the EDD regularly brings in ice asteroids of oxygen to replenish the breathable air on the planet, which doesn't strike me as very scientifically accurate. And for that matter, how did the Earth get like that even after nuclear war? It's been 500 years. Too little plant growth after the war, maybe? They don't seem to have a problem with plants in New Chicago. Anyway, Twiki is kidnapped by the leader of a mining asteroid whose name is Balsacus. Sorry, Belzac. It's very easy to make that mistake. Belzac wants to mass-produce Twiki because Twiki is apparently the most advanced ambiquad in the system, and it's implied that being around Buck has made him even more so. Wouldn't that just do the exact opposite? In this one, we get some money that's been recycled from Battlestar Galactica. And this amazing scene when Twiki ejects from the ship, along with Belzac's obviously unscripted reaction.
Here I go, Buck.
The drone is out of the ship.
I'm sorry, but you don't have to read lips to know that that's what he's saying. Now, this one would actually have been a lot more interesting if Belzac had actually succeeded in reproducing Twiki and then found that his unique attributes are unsuitable for mining. Kind of the way that Ardala discovers that her android bucks are only good for... Also, Belzac's Omniguard are essentially nothing but fan service. I mean, where do they keep getting these people? Do you advertise for them on future Craigslist or something? And, of course, it wouldn't be the 1970s without at least one sports-oriented episode, so we get Olympiad. One of the many embarrassing things about this episode is that it was meant to cash in on the 1980 Olympics that summer, but that just happened to be the Olympics that were in Moscow, which the US boycotted that year. Awkward. Even without knowing that, though, you might find this episode just a little odd. For one thing, if so many records of Earth history have been destroyed, how do they remember the Olympics? And why are all their future sports so damn goofy? There are two interesting things in this one, though. The plot is very reminiscent of the media attention that would surround Nadia Comaneci when she later defected to the United States, though, of course, they couldn't have known that back then. And that opening footage? Logan's Run. Still, we do get Wilma going undercover again in this one, which is always fun. The next episode, A Dream of Jennifer, is surprisingly good in spots. It starts with Buck seeing a woman who looks exactly like his dead girlfriend Jennifer, played here by Battlestar Galactica's Anne Lockhart. He follows her to New Orleans, the city on the sea, and then the rest of the plot happens, which isn't nearly as good. The episode dips in quality quite severely when these guys show up. God. Seriously, what gets into this show sometimes? But the rest is surprising, with Gil Gerard getting to do some of that serious acting that he always wanted to do. There's a moving scene in which Hewer talks about his dead wife.
For a year after my wife died, I had dreams. Nightmares, actually. I'd wake and expect to see her face. And then I'd remember that she was gone.
Plus, the scenes in future New Orleans, where they still have Mardi Gras, are kind of fun. It actually features a character named Nola, and if you don't get that joke, Google it. I'm not your mama, darling. In addition to Lockhart, we get Mary Warrenoff in a particularly good part, as well as Dennis Haysbert and Jesse Lawrence Ferguson in what we assume are probably their earliest roles. The season ends with 4 episodes, 3 standalones and another 2-parter, that aren't nearly as good, and in some ways they're even worse than those Gary Coleman vehicles were. The episode Space Rockers, yes, that's actually the name, features another cast of noteworthy actors, including the late Jerry Orbach, Richard Mall from Night Court, and Judy Landers, because by law, if your show was made in the 1970s, you were contractually obligated to have at least one Landers sister in at least one episode. This one has Buck traveling to Music World, yes, it's called Music World, and investigating the futuristic rock band Andromeda, and their manager, played by Orbach, who's using their music to trigger violence for reasons. This is another episode that just screams 70s, though those space rocker costumes seem to be screaming porn. No offense to the ghost of Jerry Orbach, but there are much better music-related things to enjoy him in.
Be our guest. Be our guest. Put our service to the test.
In Buck's Duel to the Death, we get an episode that feels more like an old-fashioned Buck Rogers story than just about any other episode so far, but it's so bad in too many ways to count. We have William Smith overacting all over everybody, a lead actress whose lines are all dubbed for some reason.
Neil reached Earth.
He survived.
Anne returned with a Terran named Buck Rogers, a man supposedly born in the 20th century.
Oh, yes. Yes, Darius cleverly resurrected an ancient myth that a 500-year-old man would duel the Trebor to the death and free the planet forever.
People believe in the Roshan.
Greta, the Roshan does not exist.
And we discover that they haven't used electricity in 500 years, so what exactly are they using? It also has, amusingly enough, characters whose names sound like K-Tel and Trade Whore. Apart from another decent use of Twiki, it's a fairly standard planet dominated by a dictator story that we already had at the beginning of the season, even down to the overacting.
Stop! No one kills the Roshan, but the Trebor.
The premise of the 2-part season finale, Flight of the War Witch, seems to have a lot of promise, but that promise is quickly wasted. On the one hand, we get Ardala, who's always welcome in her last appearance, and we get none other than Julie Newmar as the War Witch Zarina, a villainous ruler from a parallel universe who plays this part just like the female drag queen that she really, really is. In this one, we discover that Hewer was the first man to go through a Stargate and that he thinks of Buck as family, which makes it all the more depressing that this is his last appearance in the series. Unfortunately, there are a few other scenes here that just haven't aged well and are rough watching in 2021.
I pre-flighted your ship. I wanted to make sure everything was, A-okay.
Thank you, woman.
Well, you didn't think I was going to let you go without saying goodbye, did you?
No, I was hoping I'd see you before I left. Oh, you stop looking at me like that. I'll be fine.
I know. Funny. All of a sudden, I don't know what to say.
You don't have to say anything.
No, I want to. You're very special. You've been more than a friend to me. And I've learned a lot about myself. About being able to express my feelings. How to care for someone. You've shown me a whole side of myself that I never knew existed. I finally felt like a woman. For the first time in my life. And I'd hate to think what I'd be like if it weren't for you.
Well, you had a lot going for you from the beginning.
You have to give Erin Gray some serious props, though, because only she could make a speech like that and still make it sound good. But the internal logic in this one falls apart really quickly, much more than in any other episode. And that's it. The season's over. This one aired in March 1980, and the second season premiered in January 1981 with significant changes. Yeah. Just as well that this is that 70s review, huh? So, how well does this show hold up? I'd give it 2.5 out of 5 Twickies. Buck Rogers as a property has endless possibilities. It's really no surprise that there was still interest in it 50 years after his debut, and even now we have reports that George Clooney wants to create a brand new Buck Rogers series with Brian K. Vaughan writing the scripts. And on paper, that sounds fabulous. However, they would do well to steer away from a lot of what was done in this series, even as all the comic book revivals produced since 1979 have done. When it comes right down to it, Gil Gerard was right. This show could have been a lot more serious in tone. Mind you, any show like this needs a smidgen of comic relief, but this one tends to go way overboard with it. It jettisons a promising premise of life in a post-apocalyptic utopia in favor of a standard future society that looks almost exactly like our own. Even its strong female characters are regularly given dialogue that implies that their status as women depends solely on how much Buck is into them. And then there's Twickie, who takes a lot to be into, unless you have a screwdriver handy. Oh, God. Also, any show from this era is bound to have its share of sexist tropes, scenes that don't play well anymore, and comedy that just makes you cringe your hair out. But the joy of watching shows like this comes from being able to ignore those things in favor of good stories and good acting. But all too often, Buck Rogers in the 25th century didn't even have those going for it. And that's it for this edition of That 70s Review. Next time, I'll be looking at Space 1999. Speaking of shows that change completely out of all recognition between seasons 1 and 2. In the meantime, if you want to see more of this sort of thing, give this video a thumbs up, do that thing with the bell that you do so well, and tell me in the comments what shows from the 1970s that you would like me to cover. Till next time, stay safe and stay groovy.